Okay, so you should have received a verbal warning if you're listening that we are recording this. So if you don't want to be recorded, you should leave now, but please don't leave. Okay, so crossband repeating. All right, so first let's talk about what is repeating or what is a repeater. We all use repeaters all the time. A repeater is typically a pair of radios, one of which is receiving on a particular frequency and the other of which is transmitting on another frequency. And they're hooked together so that the audio output of the one feeds into the audio input of the other one. They're usually located on a mountain, a tall building, or with their antenna on some kind of a tall tower or something like that, so that they have greater range. They're used to increase the range of a signal, so they facilitate wide area communications, and sometimes they're used to overcome disadvantages of terrain. For example, the 6.2 repeater is on Farnsworth Peak, and it reaches pretty much the whole Salt Lake Valley, plus out into the West Desert as far as Wendover. So that's pretty good coverage. If it was here in the valley, it wouldn't be able to reach over there because there's a mountain in the way. It's also linked to a second repeater on Scotts Hill over on the east side that gives it coverage out almost as far as Evanston, I believe. So depending on where you're at over there. So it has really wide coverage. So why do we use repeaters? Repeater, each station doesn't need high power, a big antenna or whatever. An inexpensive handheld only needs enough power to reach the repeater. So for example, this radio with 5 watts can easily reach the repeater up on Farnsworth or Ensign Peak or Butterfield Canyon or any of the other repeaters around this area. Repeater can have a really good high gain antenna, allowing it to receive very weak signals. In fact, the 6.2 repeater actually has its receive radio and antenna at a separate location from its transmit radio and antenna, which is interesting. The receive antenna is located a little bit lower down on the mountain, and it's on a completely separate tower and a completely separate set of antennas. So kind of an interesting way they have that set up. What's that?
Why was that done?
Why was that done? One of the reasons was to minimize interference, because where the transmit antenna is up on top of the mountain where all the other broadcast antennas and things are. And by moving the receive antenna a little bit, they were able to avoid some of that noise. So another reason is because they had the equipment to do that, and they thought it would be cool. So, Dan?
I'll say that the MARC 220 repeater, it has a 7+ dB gain antenna on it. It's using that for the transmit and receive, but it's a very high gain antenna, which coupled with the height makes the 40-watt transmitter effectively a 320-watt transmitter.
So our Dan just explains, I'm just going to repeat this for the recording. Dan explains that our 220 repeater that we have as a club has a 7 dB gain antenna on it, and it's located at about 180 feet up on a tower. And so with a 40-watt radio, it has an effective radiated power of, did you say 320?
320, 325.
About 320 watts. So that's a serious advantage for that repeater. So a repeater can also have a higher power transmitter. For example, you're not going to want to carry a 100-watt transmitter around in your pocket or on your belt, but the repeater can easily handle that and typically can have emergency power and solar power or generator or whatever to allow it to maintain coverage even in the event of some kind of a power failure. And repeaters can be linked together to expand their range even further. Here in Utah, we have the Intermountain Intertie, which is a collection of a whole bunch of repeaters that are all linked together. So each repeater has not only a receive radio and a transmit radio, but also one or more link radios that have high gain antennas pointed directly at other mountain peaks in distant areas. The intermountain intertie, when you key up on that, you can talk to people anywhere from Idaho Falls all the way down to Las Vegas, and sometimes into California if that link is brought up or not, and sometimes up into Montana if that link is up or not. So
Arizona as well.
and Arizona as well. So repeaters give us a lot of capability, a lot of ability to improve the utilization of our very light, low power handheld radios. Not usual for you to be able to take a 5-watt handheld like this one and talk to somebody in Idaho Falls on it when you're sitting here in Salt Lake. So, or when you're sitting in Las Vegas and talking to somebody in Idaho Falls. So very, very cool. Repeaters are an amazing technology, and we really leverage them quite heavily in amateur radio. We really use their capabilities a lot. So what do we do if we can't reach the repeater? So what if I'm sitting somewhere where I don't have a good line of sight to the repeater, or I don't have enough power to get to it, or there's trees in the way, or there's terrain in the way, or something like that? I have a few options, right? I can use a better antenna. Maybe I can get a wire J-pole and sling it up into a tree so it's 40, 50 feet up in the air. That might give me enough altitude to be able to see the repeater. I can use more power if I need to burn through some tree branches or something. A little extra power can sometimes get you through where the 5 watts that you normally have don't do it. So maybe a mobile radio would be effective at getting through where your handheld can't do it. I might move to a location where I can reach the repeater. For example, if I'm at a particular place and I know that if I walk another half a mile, I'll be on top of a ridge or something, and I'll have good visibility to the repeater, I can do that and make my contacts from there. Not terribly convenient if my campground is lower down or in a gully or something, but that is a definite option to be able to do that. I can also relay communications via another station that can reach the repeater. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but the idea there is if I have my station and I'm here and there's another station over here and he can reach the repeater and I can't, I can reach him on a simplex frequency and talk to him and say, hey, I have a message that needs to get out. Can you retransmit it for me? And he says, sure, pass the message. I give him the message. He transmits it into the repeater and away it goes. So that's an option. And finally, the option that we're going to talk about tonight is we can use a crossband repeater. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. What is a crossband repeater?
Before you go on,
Yeah.
go back to the other slide.
Sure.
You can also replace the word repeater with another radio. Doesn't have to be a repeater.
That's true. It could be another simplex user, another simplex radio somewhere, and I could be on a simplex frequency, right?
Virgo, our 4th of July parade.
I have that in the presentation, so stand by. You're getting ahead of me, Dan. So, okay, so crossband repeater is typically a single radio with dual VFOs. It can be implemented as 2 radios with a little piece of hardware in between them that connects the speaker of the one radio to the microphone of the other radio, along with some mechanism to activate the PTT on the transmitting radio, either a Vox circuit or a circuit that monitors the squelch on the receiving radio and uses that to power up the PTT on the sending radio. But typically it's a single radio that has dual VFOs. It has to be able to be configured to do crossband repeat. The radio receives on one band and transmits on a different band. So for example, it receives on VHF and transmits on UHF, or receives on UHF and transmits on VHF. Why don't we want both sides of the radio on VHF or both sides on UHF? Does anybody know? Go ahead.
Because the side that's transmitting will desensitize the receiver if it's on the same band.
That's right, especially if it's on the same antenna, right?
Unless you have a full-on duplexer and the radio is configured to be shielded properly.
So Paul brings in the comment that the transmitting radio will desense the receiver on the receiving radio. That can cause us an issue because I'm getting some echo here. Let me see if I can. I don't know if I have the ability to stop that. Well, we'll see how it goes. So the transmitting radio, if it's close to the receiving radio, it will desense the receiving radio, and the receiving radio won't be able to receive anything because all it will hear is the transmitter since they're close together, particularly if they're on the same antenna. Paul mentions that we could have a duplexer, we could have multiple antennas, we could have a cavity that has a good notch filter or something like that that prevents the receive side from hearing the transmit side. But because the radios are in close proximity to each other, it's quite likely that there will be some kind of interference, especially if it's in the same unit, right? If it's in the same physical radio box. So that's something that we want to avoid. That's why we do it on alternate bands, and we call it a crossband repeater, right? So the crossband repeater can be placed where it has good coverage of an area that otherwise can't see the primary repeater. And again, as Dan mentioned, or station, right? You can do this simply entirely with simplex if you want to. This is different from a portable repeater, where a portable repeater is typically going to have that type of equipment, multiple radios, multiple antennas, cavities, whatever is necessary to be able to make it operate fully as a repeater on the same band. Did you have a comment, Bob? Okay. So let's move on. So I have a couple of case studies. The first one is the Unicorns Unleashed race that was held a couple of weeks ago. This was held in Hobble Creek Canyon. So this was a 55K run. Yes, there are people who want to run 55 kilometers at a single time. I don't know why you would want to do that, but there are people who like to do that apparently. So they had this race. Well, people who believe in something, let's put it that way. So it's a 55K trail race in Hobble Creek Canyon down in Springville. It was held August 14th from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So I guess it takes 12 hours to run 55 kilometers or walk it or whatever. I wouldn't know. The route basically goes east to the first junction and then north to the aid station at Kirkman, and then south and east curving around to the aid station at Packard Canyon, and then west to another aid station, the junction in Left Fork Canyon, and then north to turn around and come back to the aid station, and then back down to the start and finish line. Start finish was at the Steelworkers Pavilion at Kelly's Grove, and you can see the GPS coordinates of the aid stations that were used here. So aid station 1 and 5, so it was used both on the outbound leg and the inbound leg. 3 and 4 were also used on both outbound and inbound legs. So here's a map of the course, right? So you can see this is up in Hobble Creek Canyon, and you can see where the start and finish was. That's this first one down here on the lower left. And then the A's are the aid stations as you go up the trail and kind of loop around. You can see that there's optional legs that went like up to Red Pine Knoll and then around this area around Pump House Hill and back down and around. So it was a pretty involved course. So what they, just for a view up Hobble Creek Canyon, this gives you an idea of how steep the sides of this canyon are, right? So as you're going up, it's not in a straight line and you're down kind of in this slot, right? It's not quite as bad as Big Cottonwood or Little Cottonwood Canyons, but it's still got a little bit of mountain around it. So let's see. Why are we not advancing? Okay, so the radio communications plan was to use the UCARES repeater, which is on West Mountain, which is, so this Hobble Creek Canyon is to the east of the city, and West Mountain is to the west of the city. And I'll show you a wider view map in a few minutes. The repeater has a pretty good view up most of the canyon, but not all the aid stations can see the repeater due to the physical properties of the canyon. So when they first started evaluating doing radio communications for this race event, the first thought they had was, well, we can probably reach the one aid station from the other aid station on simplex and be able to relay manually. But let's also look into the option of doing a crossband repeater, and they were able to figure that out. So the solution that they settled on was to use a crossband repeater. So the main repeater was from the UCARES repeater at West Mountain, and it was on VHF on 147/340 with a positive offset and 100 hertz tone. And they identified a location for the crossband repeater up in the hills to the east and above the Packard Canyon aid station in the right fork of Hobble Creek Canyon. There was an improved dirt road that they found that went up and was up high enough to be able to look down on the aid station site and also see the repeater over on West Mountain. And they used 446/500 simplex for the local side of the crossband repeat. We'll talk more about how this gets configured and how this works in a minute. So this is the wide angle view of the layout here. So you can see where the repeater was way over here on West Mountain. Here's Spanish Fork in the middle, Springville. Here's the canyon. And they figured out that they could put the crossband repeater way up here. You can almost make out this little dirt road that goes up here. And it was able to see down into where this aid station was here, and also see the Dry Canyon aid station very well. And it was high enough that it could see the West Mountain repeater. So they were able to successfully accomplish their goal and utilize that crossband repeater for communications. So very effective use of the amateur radio technology. So let's talk a little bit about the Murray Fundays parade. This last time that we did the parade, we used our 220 repeater and everybody was able to reach it just fine. But the first time we did this parade a couple of years ago in 2019, we didn't have our own repeater. And we decided that we would use a simplex frequency for parade communications. So Dan, our illustrious founder and fearless leader, acted as the net control operator, and he was at the parade start line at Fashion Place Mall. One of the stations was located down in Murray Park by the main pavilion and couldn't see Fashion Place Mall from there. It was just down below the terrain level, and there were plenty of buildings in between, and there was just no way for good simplex signal to get to Fashion Place Mall. But there were also other stations near the parade route that were distant enough from the mall that communications wasn't great. It was really scratchy. So Dan also needed to be on a handheld so that he could be where the parade staff were and be able to get the messages, be able to pass them out. So he couldn't sit in his car with his powerful mobile radio and do the net from there. He had to be able to move around and be where the parade marshal and people were. So he had to be able to be on a handheld. Oops, sorry. So Dan used crossband repeat function in his mobile and a very tall antenna. How tall is your antenna? 40 feet, did you say?
I was using the 26-foot antenna at that point.
So Dan had a 26-foot antenna that he was able to set up near his mobile and hook his mobile up to that. And then he was able to set up crossband repeat on that so that he could use UHF on his handheld to his crossband repeater, while the crossband repeater was using VHF to talk to everybody else along the parade route. And because that antenna being at a higher altitude and being able to have additional power, how many watts does your mobile do?
Pushing 50 watts.
So 50 watts on that. Dan was able to be heard by all the stations, including the one down in the park, which was very effective. So let's see. Dan was able to
using the lowest power, I think a half a watt
on your handheld. Yeah. So on the local side of the crossband repeat, Dan's handheld was on a low power setting because it only had to go the 20 or 30 or 40 feet to where his mobile was located.
100 feet.
Several hundred feet, let's call it that. Yeah. But easily able to do that with a half a watt. So that was another effective use of a crossband repeater on a completely simplex net to be able to, facilitate that communications and support that parade event without having to take over some repeater that we did not have control of and would have had to ask permission to use for that. So very effective. All right, so let's talk about a couple of different configurations for crossband repeat. We'll talk about unidirectional first. All right, so in a unidirectional setup, you typically have a central repeater that is operating on VHF, for example. In my example case here, I use the 146.62 repeater that receives on 146.02 and transmits on 146.62. That's the repeater on 400 peak. Regular repeater operators configure their radio as normal. They receive on 146.62 and transmit on 146.02. So they just tune in their negative offset and their radio takes care of everything for them. The crossband repeater user receives the normal repeater transmission. Well, the crossband repeater, it shouldn't say user there, it should just say crossband repeater, receives the normal repeater transmissions on VHF. So it's receiving on 146.62. Oh, I'm sorry, I take it back. This is the unidirectional example. So me as a user of the crossband repeater would be receiving the normal repeater transmissions. Remember the 62 repeater has 100 watts of power. So it can probably reach me even if I can't reach it. I can probably hear it on my handheld, even if it can't hear me. So I would tune my radio to 146.62 and receive those repeater transmissions directly from the repeater. When I want to transmit, however, I would transmit on UHF on a separate frequency, for example, 446.15. And the crossband repeater is going to receive my transmissions on 446.15 and retransmit them on 146.02 to be received by the main repeater. This requires that the user's radio, this radio, for example, be dual band capable, be able to receive on one band while transmitting on a separate band. Not all radios can do that. So that's something that you do have to make this type of setup work. And I have a little diagram here that shows how this works. So we have the central repeater here. Normal repeater users are going to use their normal configuration to talk back and forth to this repeater. The transmissions from that repeater are also going to be received by my handheld out here. But when I transmit, I'm going to transmit on the UHF frequency. My crossband repeater is going to receive that and retransmit it on the VHF frequency that the repeater is listening on. So pretty straightforward what's happening there. There's also the bi-directional solution where we depend on the crossband repeater to transmit in both directions. The central repeater operates normally on VHF. So again, with a 6.2 repeater, it would be transmitting on 146.62 and receiving on 146.02. Regular repeater users do their same thing as they normally would do, but the crossband repeater is receiving the normal repeater transmissions on VHF and retransmitting them on the simplex UHF frequency. So it's, for example, receiving on 146.62 and retransmitting on 446.15. Me with my handheld, I'm going to receive that traffic on 446.15 and transmit back on 446.15. So I'm operating completely simplex on a single band, right? The crossband receiver then receives my transmissions and retransmits them on 146.02 for the main repeater to pick up. So here's a diagram of this in operation. So you can see the primary repeater in this diagram, the bands are reversed. They've got the primary repeater on UHF and the crossband on VHF, but you can do it either direction. So in this example, we've got the UHF repeater here. We've got normal repeater users over here that are transmitting and receiving on the frequency pair that this repeater would be using. We've got the crossband repeater here that is receiving on the repeater's transmit frequency and rebroadcasting on the VHF simplex frequency in this diagram. These guys are transmitting back on that VHF simplex frequency, and the crossband repeater is using the UHF transmit frequency to send back to the main repeater. So pretty straightforward. Nothing super complicated, nothing crazy happening here. Can everybody understand how this works functionally? I see one person nodding, two people nodding.
Starting to get my mind around it.
Okay,
Figure out how to make my equipment do that.
okay, so that's
I'm not that far yet.
That's the next step, right? So how do we configure this? The configurations vary by radio. So you have to look at your radio's manual to see how to do this. Unfortunately, there is no standard way to set this up. So every radio is going to do this differently. So the way you want to do it is you want to configure one side or one VFO of your radio to talk to the repeater or to essentially talk on the common simplex frequency that everybody else is using, right? In the normal case, talk to the repeater. And you want to configure the other side to talk on the simplex frequency that you're using for the crossband repeat side. And then you have to tell your radio to go into the crossband repeat mode so that it actually does the retransmissions from one side to the other side. And then you have to configure your handheld or your user radio to either receive the repeater on one VFO and transmit to the crossband repeater on the other VFO in the case of a unidirectional crossband repeat, or to operate simply on the simplex frequency in the case of the bidirectional crossband repeat. Okay. The Utah VHF Society is responsible for the band plan in Utah and has specific recommendations for crossband repeater use. They specifically suggest that you avoid operating crossband repeaters on the primary simplex frequencies, specifically 446,000 and 446,500. In the case of the Unicorns Unleashed race, they did use 446,500. That was the frequency that they chose. As long as you're not interfering with other people, you're probably okay, given that it was only for a short period of time. But that's something to think about, is you want to probably pick a frequency that is not commonly in use. And you want to pick a frequency that's in the appropriate part of the band, right? So you want to pick a frequency for your simplex side that's in the simplex part of the band. There are also a couple of reserved simplex frequencies that are listed on the Utah VHF Society page. 438,875 is reserved for crossband testing in Davis County, and 439,100 is reserved for crossband use in Spanish Fork and Utah County. Technically, they should have used that frequency for the Unicorns Unleashed, but I don't think they knew about that.
When you say they, use they?
The people who ran the Unicorns Unleashed race, right? They chose to use 446,500 as their simplex frequency. And according to Utah VHF Society, they should not have done that. So you may also want to configure that simplex side of your crossband repeater to use a PL tone. Even though you normally avoid PL tones on simplex frequencies, you may want to do that to prevent people from accidentally activating the crossband repeater when they didn't mean to. So only people who know about it and intend to use the crossband repeater would set the appropriate tone on their radio and activate that crossband repeat function. So that's something to think about as well. That's not a requirement, but it's something to consider. So I got a couple of configuration examples here. This is the radio I have in my mobile. It's an Anytone AT5888 UB3. It's actually a tri-band radio that has VHF on 2 meter and 1¼ meter and UHF on 70 centimeter. In order to activate crossband repeat, I just go into the menu system, choose menu number 44, which is the crossband repeat setting, and press the button, and away it goes. And it says X start, and now it's running in crossband repeat mode. Before I do that, I would configure the left and right sides of the radio for the appropriate repeater and simplex frequencies that I'm using. Okay. in order to get out of crossband repeat mode, all I have to do is press the set button and it will drop out of crossband repeat mode.
Is there a way you can drop that from your handheld?
We're going to talk about that in a minute. So you're reading my mind, Ragnar. So just bear with me here. Here's another example. This is a Kenwood TMV71. This also works on the D710, and it's a similar setting to the way the D700 and the V7 work. Basically, you go into menu 403 and you turn the repeater mod option to cross, and that causes it to do the crossband repeat. Again, you would set up the left VFO for your repeater side and the right VFO for your simplex side, or vice versa. I mean, I don't think it really matters because it's essentially bidirectional anyway. But that would be the convention I would follow. And then here's a configuration example for the Yaesu FT8800R. I don't know if that's even a radio that they're still selling now, but Yaesu has the same functionality. In their setting, you would go into menu mode, flip to menu 45, which is the crossband repeat menu, press the main button, and it's going to go say X start, and now it's in crossband repeater mode. And to get out of crossband repeater mode, you'd hit the set key again. Interesting thing about the Yaesu, powering the radio off and back on again does not take it out of crossband repeat mode. So that's something to think about. If you have used crossband repeat, make sure you exit that mode when you're done with it. All right. Now let's talk about the legality of things here. So our crossband repeater is sitting there all by itself. Is it an unattended station? Do I have any remote control capability of it, as Ragnar pointed out so graciously? How do I make it shut up if it starts doing something stupid? Well, the FCC requires you to have either your radio be attended or have some mechanism of remote control. Now, in most cases where you're using crossband repeat, the crossband repeater is going to be close enough to you, say a couple hundred feet away, as in the case of the parade, that somebody can hustle over there and turn it off if it starts acting stupid. You typically cannot depend on sending any kind of control signals to the radio in band, because if it does get stupid, it might get stupid in the wrong way, where say the repeater side was receiving a signal, so it's got the simplex side keyed up for transmit. It's not going to be able to receive your commands to tell it to stop because it's already transmitting on that side. So you want to have some physical way to interrupt that repeater. In the case of the Unicorns Unleashed, they actually had an operator sit there on top of the mountain with his mobile, and he was there to monitor the radio, so it was not unattended. So another legal issue is ID requirements. So when you're operating unidirectionally, it's not really a problem, right? Because as I ID, when I'm talking, so I'm on my handheld and I'm making a communication and I ID verbally over the simplex frequency, the crossband repeater then repeats my ID on the repeater frequency. So its transmission has been ID'd, right? The problem comes in the bidirectional setup where the repeater is IDing and the users of the repeater are IDing, but they're IDing with their own call signs, not the call sign of the crossband repeater. So, that can cause some concerns. We're going to talk about a solution for that in a minute. Another issue may be if I've got multiple users. So in this setup here, for example, I've got 3 people out here using the crossband repeater. Well, the crossband repeater is only being operated by one person. That person is the one who needs the ID, right? So that is a gray area legal question that you need to be thinking about. And we're going to talk about a workaround for that in a minute. Okay, so let's see. Other caveats in unidirectional mode, the users need to have a dual band radio that can receive on one band and transmit on another band. Most single VFO radios won't do that. For example, that really nice looking TYT BH350 radio that we've been talking about for replacing our Baofeng radios that the club owns because it's a tri-band. It has 3 frequencies displayed, but it can only receive on the active one. So even though I can show you that there are 3 frequencies that you're able to monitor, that particular radio only has a single VFO and it can only receive on one of those. So if I'm going to listen, I need to tune it to set my radio to the VFO or to the frequency that I'm listening on. And then when I'm ready to transmit, I need to flip it to the next one where I have the transmit frequency plugged in. That's really uncomfortable. Now, some of those radios do have a split functionality where you can actually put a receive frequency in on one band and a transmit frequency in on a different band, and the radio will take care of switching between the bands for you. I don't know if that 350 does or not. I wasn't able to figure that out from the manual. The manual was really sparse for that radio. So I'd have to actually have one in my hands to try it out and see what I can make it do. But that is something to consider. This Kenwood, for example, does not have that split functionality. So I need to use both VFOs on it to be able to do this. I need to have one VFO on the VHF side and one on the UHF side. And so I can transmit on the one, but monitor on the other. It does have that capability. In fact, this radio can do crossband repeat all by itself. So I can configure this radio to be a crossband repeater. So that's kind of a cool thing. As far as satisfying the ID requirements, the typical way to work around that when you're operating in bidirectional mode is every 10 minutes or so, flip your radio to the other side and ID. So if I'm sitting there on the UHF frequency that I'm normally using, every 10 minutes or so, I'm going to flip my radio to the VHF frequency that my crossband repeater is listening for the main repeater to be talking, and quickly ID, and it will happily transmit that out on the UHF side where nobody's listening, but at least I've ID'd that radio on that frequency. And then I can flip back and use it the way I want to use it for the next 10 minutes. I just have to remember to do that anytime that someone has made a transmission. Go ahead, Ragnar.
I have a question on, I remember doing auto patch on 146.76. And I knew how it was set up at Gordon Smith's place. Anyway, they had you could talk on 220, but he had it. There was also a guy that had, phone patch capabilities in Utah County, and another person up in Ottawa. So they would all be local calls.
Right.
But you would just, you did *7
To activate the patch.
Activate the patch, and then it would connect the 220 up to Gordon's house. And then it would automatically get a dial tone. And then you dial in your number.
So in that case, so Ragnar brings up the case of an auto patch type setup that he's used in the past, where you are essentially bringing up a telephone, they call it POTS connection or plain old telephone service connection through the repeater. And in that case, Ragnar, the repeater controller is handling the IDing for itself, right? So if you like use the 6.2 repeater and you key up and make a transmission and it hasn't been used in 10 minutes, that repeater is going to give a Morse code ID for itself, right? And some radios, I don't have a list of them, but some radios, when you put them in crossband repeat mode, will do that. They will actually do an automatic ID every however often, every 10 minutes, for example. Lose it. Come on. What are we doing?
it comes back.
Will it come back?
You may have hit the, there's a HDMI transformer down by your feet that I keep on getting.
Or not? Oh, wait. That might have been it. Yep, that was it. Okay. All right.
Man, remember.
We lost it on that. We lost our stream.
Okay, I gotta find the other side of my presentation here. Where'd you go?
So these things that you were talking about, this is why when I'm using repeaters, I'll hear that little faint or slow.
Yes, that is the repeater identifying for itself.
Whose call sign is that?
That's the repeater's call sign.
There's a user.
So it's whoever the trustee for the repeater is,
Okay.
right? So for example, ours should be identifying with N7 MRY. Yeah, so, okay, let me see. Where did you go?
Incidentally, when you hear that tone, yeah, Morse code, you can transmit over it. You don't have to wait for it to be
I've noticed
done.
people doing that in their works.
Yeah. The repeater allows you to send that. The requirement is to transmit your ID. It is not to receive the ID.
One of you,
Where'd
one
it
of
go?
the sayings at previous meeting, Chuck County Areas, has a practice sometimes of just 50 people, okay, everybody ID now. And so they're just 50 people cover IDs out, nobody understands anything that I got transmitted.
Yeah, right.
I don't suppose you got the Zoom back by chance?
No.
Of course not.
Your screen share is not.
Let's see if I can find, there it is. Here we go. Okay. Screen share.
When I first started using radio a few months ago.
What about now?
I was on the other side, I kept hearing
Okay.
ID2, ID4, and I started searching hard, and I think I figured out it was your airport. No. No? Well, there are some Idaho small airport IDs that are listed on the internet with those same.
Oh, sure. What's
So I thought I
happening,
found it.
what's happening there is that the call sign on that repeater is K7JL. If you key while you're hearing that one ID one, that or 124, it will, because it doesn't want to bury the users with a voice ID that conflicts with the user, it switches immediately and does the CW version. When you hear one ID one or one ID three or something like that, that is the default that came with the repeater controller that has not been programmed for the user's call sign.
Okay.
So.
And should have been.
And should. So if you listen to the Tuesday night PHS Society net and it goes 40 minutes and that's all you hear, repeater's gone 40 minutes without any. So that's an issue.
Got it. Thank you.
So Max and Paul were just talking about the ID that you're hearing from the repeater, where that's actually coming from, and how a repeater misconfiguration can cause your repeater to fail to ID, which is a bad thing. Okay, so just to finish up here, so one of the options is you switch to the other frequency and you transmit your ID, and that satisfies the requirement. Another option is there are hardware solutions that you would plug into your radio, and every 10 minutes it will key up and transmit your call sign in Morse code, for example. Or some radios include that ID function built into their crossband repeat mode. And again, unfortunately, I do not have a list of repeaters, of radios that have that function. I wish I did. I know that my repeater, my Anytone repeater radio does not have that function. So I don't know if the Kenwood does or the Yaesu that I showed the example for. So let's see. There is a message in chat. Vern never lost his audio. Okay, that's good. Okay, so yeah, that's about it. So thanks to Roger Brown, AG7YV. He was the coordinator for the Unicorns Unleashed, and he provided me with all that information and the maps and everything. So that was really awesome that he did that, and I really appreciate that. I also had copies of the operating manuals for those 3 radios that I hijacked a copy of the page out of that shows how to configure those. And then I have a few websites here that talk about crossband repeat, some of the issues that you might encounter. You will find that crossband repeat can be somewhat of a fiery topic on web-based forums, because people will say, it's illegal, you can't do that. And then they will say, oh yes, no one cares. And then they will say, well, someone might care, but it's still illegal. And then they will say, yes, but you can make it legal if you do this. And you'll find a lot of that noise on there if you Google for crossband repeat. So take what you read with a grain of salt, read the regulations, try to operate legally as well as you can. And if you're way up in the mountains where nobody else is, probably nobody's going to care. But you know, we all want to operate legally when we can. So something to keep in mind. There are those 2 legal issues that can come up: the remote controllability of the crossband repeater and the requirement for IDing the crossband repeater. So those are things that you should consider and think about when you are implementing a crossband repeater. Also, you probably don't want to set a crossband repeater up and leave it up for a month or longer. You probably want to put it up for the duration of your event or the length of time that you need to use it. Minimize that as much as you can, and you will minimize the chances of you interfering with someone else and getting in trouble. So that's about it. So any questions or comments? Paul?
Just a couple of other caveats. Some repeaters, including on 2 meters, are set up with what's called a squelch tail, or that's the wrong term for it, but when the user on keys and you hear a little courtesy beep,
A little courtesy tone, yeah.
the carrier continues for 5 seconds. Avoid using one of those repeaters in a crossband repeater scheme, because that tail will hold up the 440 transmitter and not let you get back into it till it's finished. And if a number of users on 2 meters don't wait for that to drop, you'll never get it back.
Now, that actually is somewhat, so Paul brings up the case of if a repeater has a courtesy tone at the end of a transmission, or a long, a Roger beep, right? Or a long tail on a transmission where you unkey and it leaves the transmitter engaged for a few seconds after you unkey. If the repeater is configured correctly and is using a CTCSS tone correctly, it will drop the tone before it stops transmitting. And your crossband repeater will stop retransmitting when the tone drops, because it won't be receiving, that signal won't be breaking squelch on your crossband repeater. But you have no guarantee that they configured that repeater correctly. So you should, as Paul points out, avoid using repeaters that have that capability or that function.
Well, and
So-
configured correctly is a perjured term, because the repeater operator may want it configured that way for some other reason. You're the weekend visitor. So
That's
it's up to
very
you-
true.
it's up to you to work around it.
That's very true.
The other thing is, if it's going to be a 2 meter repeater that's in use a lot, make sure that the transmitter is configured in low power on the UHF local side, or you can melt the radio.
Yes, that is another point that Paul mentions, is think about your duty cycle. So your typical mobile is not designed to be transmitting continuously. And so if your repeater side that you're listening to and retransmitting is really busy, your UHF side that is retransmitting might get extremely hot, and you probably want to use a very low power on that setting. You probably want to use a low power on that band anyway, but that's another reason why you would want to do that, is you would want to minimize the chances of melting your finals. So
I'm enjoying
Max.
this communication kind of thing you do. Jan's talking me into why this is cool, and Paul's telling me my radio's will explode. This is good.
If you look at the way an actual repeater is built, they have gigantic heat sinks on them, and they're designed so that they can be keyed down continuously forever. Because in some emergency situations during nets, they might be. If you look at the way a mobile radio, or, you know, Jen mentioned this handheld can be set up for crossband.
Yeah, if I was using this for a crossband repeater, this actually has a capability that if you put it in crossband repeat mode, it has an automatic 3-minute timeout timer. So it will stop after 3 minutes, even if the side that it's receiving is still busy.
And
So-
if your mobile radio has that, go ahead and program that.
Yeah, you probably want to do that. So
Quick question, I know the one that, repeated the Taylorsville and Oak Creek uses. I mean, if each one of us were to use it right after another, it would, it times out.
So if you're coming in-
Yeah.
if you're coming in before it stops transmitting, that's correct. Yeah, so
Which makes me curious with that one, it's like, I'm assuming be the courteous one, not only give space for some, you know, allow that time for somebody to break in, so that the repeater has a chance to reset itself.
yeah, that's always a good idea. When you're working on a repeater, Dave brings up the factor that the repeater that Taylorsville uses, if you're going back to back transmissions on that, it never unkeys. So when you're using a repeater, one of the things that you should do is stop transmitting and wait a few seconds to allow another station to break in, for example. If somebody had emergency traffic and you were going back and forth like that, they'd have no chance of getting in. And I've heard people do that. In fact, I've heard people do that on the intertie, which is super frustrating because they're on some other repeater that's part of the intertie, and they're talking to each other just fine back and forth. But meanwhile, the entire intertie is tied up with their transmission, and there's no way you can get in. A factor on a linked repeater system like the intertie, when you first key up, you need to key up and then wait a second or two for all the other repeaters in the system to key up before you start talking, or some people won't hear what you say, or at least won't hear the meaning of what you say. So when you do that, where you're going back to back like that, and you're just constantly leaving a very small pause in between your transmissions or no pause at all, that's really a not good way of using a repeater. So you should avoid doing that. Always try to leave a little gap.
And I heard a QSO one time, I think it was on the intertie. A couple of guys were going back and forth for an extended period, and then you started hearing some other tones come across the repeater.
Somebody's trying to get on a control link and shut them down.
The trustee got on and said, that's tones from the repeater saying it's overheating.
Ah, okay.
He knew what it was, and he suggested they maybe adjourn to a different repeater
Yeah.
or give it a rest.
Yeah.
Always put it on the phone.
Yeah, Paul.
Especially like you say, the intertie is to make contacts.
Not for long
not for long
winded
chats,
conversations,
because
right?
it's- Because it's such an extensive
Yeah.
system.
Paul, you had another comment?
In the context of talking about the repeater resetting that timeout timer, I heard somebody mention down the road here about, a Roger beep. Roger beep and courtesy tone are two completely different things. A Roger beep is sent by the transmitter of the user and should be avoided on the repeater because it can be mistaken for a courtesy beep. The Roger beep means the user has unkeyed his radio. The courtesy beep is sent by the repeater, often at the same pitch as the Morse code ID will be sent. What it means is that 3-minute timer has been reset. So if you don't wait for the repeater's beep, however long you're transmitting is being added on to however long the previous station transmitted to time it out. That timer that shuts the repeater down and on a long-winded transmission doesn't reset until you get that beep. So if you have a courtesy beep configured on your radio, there's almost no reason to do that on FM simplex even. But if you have it configured, you're using a repeater and a user mistakes that for the repeater's courtesy tone, they're going to feel they can start transmitting immediately, and the repeater may not have reset. So if you want to use a Roger beep On simplex, that's up to you, but on a repeater, you should really turn it off.
It's a great thing on FRS radios, but on. FM
On ham radios, you should avoid it, right? So Paul's comments are about the difference between the Roger beep, which is sent from the user's radio, and the repeater's courtesy tone, where the courtesy tone is indicating that the repeater has reset its timeout timer or its transmit timer. That's being different from the Roger beep that just indicates that the user has unkeyed their radio. So good points.
I remember learning some of my first net control things were on the Wasatch 35 years ago. We didn't have as many repeaters around then. And I remember being instilled in my head, you're the net control operator, you're responsible for what's going on. And you have to stop every few minutes and say break for reset. And break for repeaters reset, that's what we used to say. And it was so everyone would stop talking. It's, you know, when everyone's trying to get into net control and that, it's real easy
To keep that repeater busy, right? Yeah. So Ragnar brings up that, I'm just repeating this for the recording. So Ragnar brings up that when he was doing the Wasatch 100 several years ago, that it was instilled in him as a net control operator to make sure that you break periodically. Even if you're in the midst of a long transmission, you need to pause periodically and say break for reset or break for repeater reset to allow the repeater to have a chance to settle down, and also to allow any emergency traffic stations to come in. And we do that. We actually have that in our Sunday Net script. We have specific breakpoints listed in the script where we say, you know, after you finish saying this paragraph, you want to say break and unkey for a moment to allow for any emergency traffic to come through. So all good points. And I see that our Aries people have had to leave us for their meeting at 7:30, but we can continue to chat for as long as we want to. So any other questions or comments? No?
Vern had a comment. He says my ICOM 2730A is supposed to be able to be a crossband repeater.
So that's something that we would need to check the manual for, Vern, and be able to identify if that, you know, how to configure that radio to do that. Most of your mobile radios from ICOM, Kenwood, and Yaesu are probably going to have the capability. When you start looking at, you know, TYT, Anytone, Baofeng, you're probably less likely to encounter that. But if it's a mobile radio, it might have that capability. Now, whether it has
a lot of capabilities built into them, it's just their structure to set them up may be more challenging.
yes, their menus may be harder to understand. Their manual may be much harder to understand.
Maybe not be as automatically configured.
Their manual may not actually tell you how to set it up correctly. So that's something to consider. If you, and also, you know, some of those radios may have that remote IDing feature built in and some may not. So quite often the manual is not going to tell you. So that's something that you need to be able to consider. So when you're trying to use crossband repeat, again, it's probably something that you want to use in specified situations where you look at a situation and say, man, if I had a repeater right here, this would be so much easier. That would be a place where you'd put your crossband repeater. So for the duration of your event, whatever it is.
Is there a way we can practice this?
So Gordon asks if we can practice this, and yes, we certainly can. We can sure set up a crossband repeater somewhere and use it, like we did for the parade. We could do it on a simplex frequency, or we could do it on our repeater. Our repeater on 220 is on VHF, so we could do the crossband for VHF to UHF with that. We would probably want, for a practice situation, we probably would not want to be in a position where we have to depend on that. But you could certainly set up a crossband repeater anywhere that can reach the main repeater and then operate on simplex and try that out. So.
Yeah, just so we understand how it's going to work if our radio does ID or not.
Yes. One other factor to consider is if you're utilizing multiple crossband repeaters for your event, you want to make sure that you coordinate the simplex frequencies that you're using so they don't conflict with each other. You don't want a crossband repeater here using 446.15 and a crossband repeater here using 446.15. You should pick different UHF frequencies, for example. So just something to consider and think about when you're setting that kind of thing up. And for a test that we might do, we might set up several crossband repeaters for that functionality to be able to test it. So, we could certainly do that as an exercise for a during a meeting. If we're going to do that, we probably want to do it when the weather is good. So next month or October might be good times for that.
Right, because we're probably going to be using our mobile, our vehicle.
Quite likely. Okay. Other questions, comments, anything? If not, I'm going to wrap it up. I'm going to stop. What's that?
Yes, now's the appropriate.
You may applaud now if you would like. Yes. I'm going to stop the recording.
Using emoticons to applaud.
We'll stop the recording.